Hello everyone, today we're going to continue. We'll be looking at the Certified Kubernetes Administrator question bank. Today we'll officially start with the first question. There are a total of 16 questions. The relatively good thing about the CKA certification is this. We don't have too many connections between each question. This is compared with what we have said before. Before the Red Hat certification, there was actually a connection between the previous and next questions. If you don't solve any of the previous questions, it will affect the later questions. For the CKA certification, basically each question is independent, so you don't need to worry too much about, for example, if you make a mistake on one question, it will affect the following questions. That's not really an issue here. It basically doesn't happen. So for each question you answer, you get the score for that question. So here, everyone should try their best. After you finish a question and check it carefully, then you can move on to the next one. This also applies when you're practicing if you only complete half of a question. Aren't there 16 questions? After you've done a few, if you have something else to do, just go take care of it. It's totally fine. You don't need to save anything. Just shut on the computer, that's all. When you restore the snapshot again, you can just pick up where you left off. You can also practice one question at a time, and that's fine too. There's no connection between the questions. That's one of the benefits of this approach. It makes practicing more convenient since each question is independent. You can practice them separate once you've mastered one question, then move on to the next, and that's totally fine. In the end, you should go through the whole set a few times in one go. Basically, as long as you can do all the questions in about an hour and a half, you're ready to schedule the exam. Like I mentioned before, the actual exam environment is a bit more sluggish than our practice environment. So you really need to make sure of this. In our practice environment, once you can finish everything in an hour and a half, then you can go ahead and schedule your exam, because the actual exam environment will be a bit more laggy. Some lag is completely normal since after all you're taking the exam remotely. That's just how remote exams are. Alright, so these are some basic points to keep in mind. Next, let's start with the first question and go through it in detail. First of all, the first question is about automatic scaling. The main focus here is on automatic scaling and shrinking. About us, pod scaling issue. So what exactly does the question require? Let's first take a quick look at the requirements of the question. In the question, we are asked to create a HPA, a deployment, and a namespace. So the main resources involved are these three. This question mainly deals with these three resources. Among these three resources, let's take a look. For now, just pay attention to the names of these resources. For all the questions, when it comes to the names of resources mentioned in the question, you don't need to memorize them rigidly. Or you don't even need to memorize them at all, because during the exam, what often happens is this. The exam isn't just a single set of questions. It's not just one set. The exam randomly draws a question from several different sets. So what's the main difference? The main difference between these questions is mainly about, the main difference is just the variation in the parameters. The questions themselves are basically the same. The question stem and the type are the same. The only thing that changes is the parameters. For example, in this question, we have three resources, right? So these three resources are the things that might change. So just pay attention to this point here, everyone. Also, during the actual exam, we won't be using the administrator account. Please note that in our overall lab environment, we don't use the administrator, or root use everything is done under a regular user account. Under a regular user, you'll remotely access different hosts to perform certain operations. So make sure to pay close attention to this point. Here, we do not use the administrator account. We only use a regular user to remotely access other hosts and perform operations. Please pay attention to this. Each question will have its own requirements, every single one. First, make sure to carefully check the names of all the resources. That's the first point. Second, and even more important, is to pay attention to exactly where you are supposed to carry out the task. Where should you perform the task? This is something you need to pay close attention to. Of course, in our environment, you can actually switch the administrator account. That's not a problem. It's possible to switch. However, during the actual exam, we do not use the administrator account. We mainly use a regular user to remotely access different machines and complete the task as a regular user. Everyone, please make sure to pay attention to this. In this case, your permissions definitely won't be that high, but for the tasks in this exam, you basically don't need elevated permissions. We mainly use a regular user to edit the required content. So these are some of the basic points you need to keep in mind. Next, let's move on to a hands-on demonstration of how to tackle our first question, which is about HPA automatic scaling. For each question, I've marked something here what do you need to pay special attention to? You must be clear about which remote host you're working on. This is very important, so please keep it in mind. First of all, the basic requirements in the question are about a specific detail about scaling is mainly related to CPU usage. 50% is the threshold or trigger for scaling. Secondly, the number of puts required is from 1 to 4, which is the minimum one. And the maximum of 4. Additionally, when scaling down, there is a stabilization window of 30 seconds. This is actually the standard for scaling up or down. Under what circumstances do we scale up? When CPU usage reaches 50%. For scaling down, if the CPU usage falls below this threshold, you have to wait 30 seconds before scaling down. The scaling range is a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 4 pods. That means you must always keep at least 1 pod, and when CPU usage is high, you scale up to a maximum of 4 pods. These are the basic requirements we need to mention. Next, let's go ahead and do a hands-on operation. Here, please pay attention to this point. When you're working on this, first of all, because we are a client, right? We ourselves are a client, okay? Or in other words, we are not actually the management side, not the management end of this cluster. So first we need to use this command. After remotely connecting to the control node, we can then proceed with the specific operations. So here, let's take a look at the details. For this particular task, the first step is that we need to connect remotely. During the exam, you will also be using a regular user account by default. So what do we need to do? As a regular user, what we need to do is remotely connect to our management node. Once you've accessed the management node, you can proceed with the operations. For this task, when we remotely connect to the management node, this is the hostname, the passwordless login has already been set up in advance. So you can use it directly, which is quite convenient. The environment already has passwordless access configured. Next, let's first look at the basic operation required for the first question. The requirement is actually very simple. It's about automatic scaling. There are 3 requirements. As long as we configure these 3 requirements 51% up to 4 and 30 seconds, this question will be no problem. Next, let's take a look at the specific configuration. First, let's remotely connect to the host required for this question. Let's first remotely connect to the host specified in this question. Alright, after we've connected remotely, we can see that its main host name has changed to master. Master is our management node. With the management node, we can now execute commands as usual. Next, let's take a closer look at this question. First of all, during the exam, of course, you can also do things like visit the official website's help documentation. That's totally fine. There's no problem with referring to the official help docs. Of course, actually, there aren't that many commands to remember. So it's best to recommend that everyone try to memorize all the commands for each question. What happens after you write it down? You actually won't need to look at the official documentation. That way you can type faster as well. Try as much as possible not to rely on anything else, just rely on yourself when writing. And your success rate will definitely be the highest. If there's something you're not very familiar with or you forget, you can occasionally take a look. That's fine. You can just visit the official documentation. Just search for whatever the question is testing you on. There's a lot of content on the official website, so you can check it directly. Of course, you can't just copy it directly. There are a lot of examples on the official site. You should follow those examples and make modifications, especially to the parameters. They definitely need to be changed. As for the examples, you don't have to use every single option. Just refer to the way things are written on the official site. But ideally, you should memorize everything yourself. That's the best approach, because then you can complete all 16 questions in one go without any issues, and it also saves time. This is to prevent situations where, for example, your internet connection isn't very stable. It could cause issues for you. This could affect your exam timing, right? So when you take the exam, if you need to use a VPN, make sure to set it up in advance. Get it ready ahead of time. Don't wait until the exam starts to realize there's a problem. If your VPN lags even a little, you might not have enough time. If that happens, you won't make it in time. So first, let's take a look at this. How do we create it using commands? First of all, there's another good point here. In all of our questions, what can we use? We can use the tab key to automatically complete our commands, including some of the main parameters. Of course, for parameters, we usually need to type them ourselves. But as for the commands, most of them can be auto-completed. the parameters might change from question to question, so we just handle those as usual ourselves. Just right, according to the requirements of the question. So here, first, let's create ours. Just use the command to create it. Of course, if you have a solid foundation, if you know how to directly use a YAML file to create it yourself, that's also fine. But relatively speaking, using commands to create it is actually faster. If you write it using a file, the format might look nicer and be more organized, but it takes more time. Using commands is the fastest. Using commands is the fastest. So here I recommend everyone use commands to create it. So first, let's create ours. Namespace, of course. We're not creating a namespace, we're specifying a namespace. According to the requirements in the question, we specify the namespace. Here, you can also use auto-completion directly because the namespace is an already existing parameter, it's an already existing parameter, so it can be auto-completed directly. That's the first point. Second, next, we write out our specific one. The name of the deployment is a requirement specified in the question. This is the requirement in the question, so pay attention here. These are all issues related to naming. As for these names, they are things that might change during the exam. They are things that could change. Of course, it's not guaranteed that they will always change. If you're lucky, you might get a question in the exam that's very similar to the ones in your question bank with similar parameters and such. So there might be fewer things you need to change. But if you're unlucky, you might encounter a lot of things that need to be changed. And there's really nothing you can do about that. So here, using the type key for auto-completion is relatively more convenient. Just follow the requirements in the question, look at what the question asks for, and use the parameters it specifies. Just use whatever parameters the question asks for. So here, first, let's specify our namespace, including our deployment. What comes next? What do we modify next? Now, we move on to specifying some parameters related to the CPU. First, when we specify the CPU here, we use what percentage should it be set to? The requirement in the question is 50, right? So when it goes above 50, it will scale up. Next, what about the minimum value? Well, when you're using autocomplete here, there's a bit of an issue with autocomplete to max when you type M, but it doesn't autocomplete min, so you have to type min yourself. Once you get to this point, it will autocomplete. The minimum and maximum values, they can simply be 1 and 4, respectively. All right, that's the second requirement. Now we've met both requirements, right? There's one last requirement. For the 30-second time setting, it's not very convenient to configure it directly through commands. So after we finish creating it in a moment, we'll just modify the file. We'll change the file in a bit, and that'll do. That's how it is. Actually, the most convenient way is to use a simple command to create the overall HPA resource first, and then modify the file afterward. This approach is the easiest because, as you all know, when we usually create resources, the commands we type are actually just a small part. So what are most of the commands actually? Most of the commands are actually auto-generated. So after we create a resource using just 1 or 2 simple options, it will automatically fill in a lot of the command details for us. A lot of default parameters will be filled in as well. At this point, it's very convenient to open the file and make changes, just use the edit command to modify. So here, let's create it first. The full name of this HPA is especially long, so you don't need to type it out or remember it. How should I put this? Its full name is just way too long. You really don't need to memorize it when you need to use it. Just look it up, that's enough. There's no need to remember it. So at this point, we can go ahead and create our basic resource. See, this is its name. Why do I say you don't need to remember it? It's actually just an abbreviation, just 3 letters. So if you want to remember it, it's just a bit too long. So if you can't remember it easily, you can simply use HBA right away without any hesitation. All right. After we create it here, just to be clear, let me emphasize once again, the very first one, as I mentioned earlier, is the name of the namespace, which is specified in the requirements of the exercise. The second one refers to a deployment that needs to be set to auto scale. So here, please pay attention and don't mix them up. Then, after we've created this, there's still a third requirement we haven't completed yet, right? So what does the third requirement ask us to do? It asks us to set the scale down stabilization window to 30 seconds. So what should we do now? Well, open our file, of course. We haven't written the file yet, right? So what do? Normally, we can modify it through the file. That's one way. Or we can also just use the edit command. With this command, we can directly edit our resources. Don't remember HBA. Don't remember it. Let me delete it here for everyone. You can just type H and then the tab key, and it will autocomplete for you. If you had to memorize this, even if you could remember it, typing it out would still be slow, right? Here, I just type 3 letters and it auto-completes the entire resource name. The resource name really is long. It's definitely a bit long. Here, we can just edit it directly. Okay, once we're in, what did we just specify? We only set it to 50%, right? And what else? The maximum and minimum values. See? Here, this is our maximum value, right? The minimum is 50%, so we just have these 3. Now, where do we find this window time of 30 seconds? Let's scroll down. Let's take a look over here. We just need to simply add 3 new lines right below our maximum value here at this stage in the code, just as shown. So here, first of all, this part is actually just to specify this is what we call a custom scaling behavior. For custom scaling, you see this parameter is actually not set by default. This parameter isn't there by default. So here we need to define and specify it ourselves. As for the indentation here, you can see that the default indentation is 2 spaces. So we should follow that and use 2 spaces for indentation as well. Make sure to get the indentation right. Here, for our entire YML file, what's actually most important? It's really about the indentation and also the punctuation. Pay attention to colons, make sure there's always a space or a line break after a colon. As for indentation, let's standardize on 2 spaces, not 4. 4 spaces is also fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But if you use 4 spaces, the file will get stretched out, and sometimes it's harder to align things properly. So here, it's best if you just use 2 spaces. That's the most convenient, really the most convenient. Now, what else do we need to write here? We need to add one more thing. Our window, a time value. That is, how many seconds is the window time for our stream processing? It's 30 seconds, right? That's what we're specifying. This word is a bit long, so just spend a little time memorizing it. Actually, you don't really need to memorize this. If you type it a few more times, you'll naturally remember it. Just type it a few more times and you'll have it down. Okay? Pay attention, there are 2 capital letters in this word. In Windows and second, there are 2 capital letters. So keep an eye on that. The first letter is not capitalized. In our case, in this UML file, you can see that many of the letters follow certain patterns. The first letter is always lowercase, while the following words may start with a capital letter. See, the first letter is always lowercase, and the subsequent words are capitalized. There are a lot of examples like this, right? Especially for command options that are made up of multiple words joined together, you see? The following words are capitalized, but the first letter is not. Make sure you don't get this wrong case. Sensitivity is very important. If you get the capitalization wrong, the system won't recognize it because our system strictly distinguishes between uppercase and lowercase. So you have to write it correctly. So pay attention to this here. After making changes, remember to save. So what were we actually doing just now, right? We were working in a temporary file. It was in a temporary file, right? Wait, did I forget to save it just now? Let me check. It seems like I exited without saving just now. So here, let's edit it again. I didn't save it just now. It's okay, we'll just write it again. Here, what you need to do is... Actually, for many problems, you don't necessarily have to practice in the environment. You can also do what? You can just... If sometimes you don't have time to open the environment, right? And you just want to practice a bit, is that okay? That's fine too. You can just look at the question bank and type out the requirements from the questions. Type them out once or a few times, actually. That's the same as practicing the question bank itself. The main purpose of practicing the question bank is what? Is that after you finish practicing, we can have a process of verification, right? The main advantage of the question bank in the environment is that we can verify verification, is the main benefit. If you don't have the environment open or your computer isn't nearby or something, you can just look at the question bank, right? You can memorize the content in the question bank or directly type out some of the commands from the question bank. Right? In other words, it just skips a step in the verification process. Okay, this time we've saved it here. Last time I forgot to save and just exited directly. Now that we've saved it here, what can we do next? Look, it already notifies us that we've edited it successfully. This means we've successfully made the changes. Next, let's check it. How do we check? The checking method for each question will be a bit different because the requirements for each question are not the same. So please pay attention. Besides completing the question, the second thing to keep in mind is that you must check your work after finishing each question. Since the checking method for each question is different, you also need to remember the steps for checking. Make sure to remember how to check each step. Otherwise, if you just finish the task, in many cases, even if you complete it without any errors, it doesn't necessarily mean you're correct. Why is that? Because there are things like parameters, right? What if you got a parameter name wrong or something? If the name is wrong, actually, that's not a big deal. Yeah, getting the name wrong is actually not a big deal. There are many words which are actually a what. If you are 100% wrong, will it report an error? It won't report an error. You can write 50% as 5% 59, right? Write it at 60%. It won't throw an error because of that. As long as you meet its syntax requirements, right? It won't actually check your specific parameters, including the number, whether it's 1 or 4, right? Does it check? No, it doesn't. It doesn't check. So in the end, you still need to check these things yourself. After you execute a command and there's no error, the good news is that your syntax is definitely correct, that's for sure. However, that doesn't necessarily mean your answer is correct. Okay, so everyone, please pay attention to this. Therefore, the most important thing is actually the details. That is, the solution to each problem. I have told you also you must remember the details of each problem. Make sure you understand them clearly. Don't misspell words. Don't get numbers wrong. For parameters, including resource names, make sure not to make mistakes. If you have questions, write them down and pay attention to all these things. Once you figure these out, there really aren't any major issues left. So that's basically it. That's the solution to our first question. After finishing that, next we need to verify it. For verification, first we use this. Again, our namespace is this one. That's correct. Just fill it in directly. Then we go and check, right? Use our get command to check our results. This one is too long, so I won't read it out loud. Let's just take a look directly. Okay, here we can see the result. CPU at 50%, no problem, right? Minimum value is 1, maximum is 4. As for that 30-second interval, if you want to check it, you can just edit it again. The 30-second interval means if you want to check, just edit that file again. Here, you need to make sure, right? These three values must meet the requirements of the question. And as for the file itself, you can also double check whether you set the time correctly. 30 seconds since it doesn't actually check the time. Just keep this in mind, everyone. When we edit this configuration file, what does it check? It only checks your syntax, as long as your syntax is correct. As long as your syntax is correct. It won't, be too strict about this. As for the timing, you can see here our 30 seconds matches up, right? If the 30 seconds matches, then there's no problem. Here, you just need to check that it's 30 seconds. Because as long as you've saved it successfully, it will definitely take effect. However, after saving, it will make a simple adjustment to your content according to its original syntax and structure. You can see where the content we actually wrote is this line here is the one we added ourselves, right? And which other line? This line is also the one we added ourselves, and this one too. Its structure has changed a little compared to before, meaning it made some simple modifications. But that's not a problem, there's nothing to worry about. In the end, as long as you make sure that your 30 seconds here is correct, that's all that matters. The previous part will definitely be correct, because as long as you can save successfully, it means your syntax is definitely right. The main thing is just to check your timing, okay? For this, we don't need to save it again. Just check it, take a look, and there's no need to save. Alright, what does this mean here? It's telling you that your configuration has been cancelled because you didn't save it. So this is the situation for our first question. Okay, at this point, the verification is complete. And then for the next step, pay attention. You must exit, okay? You must exit. Only after you exit can you move on to the next question. This is the complete solution for our first question. If you need a full question bank, you can leave a comment below and get the most reliable question bank at the best price. That's all for today, everyone. Bye-bye.